Hello everybody, and thank you for joining us for another Res Publica webinar on one of the great issues of the day, which of course is influenced by COVID, but happily perhaps because you might have COVID fatigue, it's not, the subject is not directly COVID. It's really about education, skills, how we dispense the goods of education to all of our people, not just the ones who have traditionally received it. So long before the outbreak of coronavirus, the public discourse about the UK's education and skills system was exclusively focused on whether it is fit for a present purpose or indeed equipped to face the challenges of the future. You know all this: automation, the fourth industrial revolution, and the future of work. In some respects, COVID has accelerated these issues. Technology has made remote working a new reality for many, though not all, but it's also demanded a reassessment of so-called lower skilled employment in the face of the vital role that many have provided in health and care, food processing, food retail, logistics, and other sectors. So as we emerge from this pandemic, as hopefully the vaccine is letting us, and look to economic recovery, we will need the skills to drive innovation, productivity, and growth. The priority must, of course, be to avoid mass unemployment and re-skill people. But how might we chart a way into the unknown, where, as Res Publica discussed in a recent report, the jobs of the future don't yet exist? What precisely are we going to train people for, and how might we train them differently? We don't even really have a very good grasp on the nature and future of work. We have all sorts of ideas. We only know that our present model is broken. If you look at the UK, especially in comparison to our peer competitors in terms of innovation, productivity, and skills, we don't do a particularly good job. And there's a long-running debate about the abandonment of those who don't follow the academic path and are variously treated as second or arguably third class recipients of something like FE. There's been much debate and some noble attempts to reprise apprenticeships, but that won't necessarily pave a way to a future where the working classes, if I can put it like that, might enjoy all the fruits of their labor, since Britain is predominantly a service export nation. And we can't very well all be like Germany, since Germany has an entirely different economic model. It simply makes twice as much as we do, though we, of course, in our service offer, do more than they do. So what do we need? What's the new system that we can facilitate? There's an urgent need for many things. First of all, an integrated tertiary system that can respond to employer demand, provide bespoke, just-in-time training solutions, and crucially, of course, facilitate lifelong learning, because the one thing we know about the future is that time is speeding up. And we've never really been very good at, though we use the term, reskilling or teaching people again new skills. They're predominantly for the very wealthy who might do a graduate degree or an MBA. But the idea of facilitating this on a mass level doesn't particularly have a good history in our country, though it's apparently needed more than ever. But what might that mean? We know that there is a financial return to education, though we know that's also diminishing. And for certain courses, just in financial terms, there isn't particularly a return at all. So what is the new contract and the new base in a competitive capitalist world, which looks very much like the world will still be, arguably even more rapacious than it has been at certain times in the past? This is what I want this seminar to focus in on. What should the new education and skills system look like? Should we scale down our current undergraduate offer, stop sending so many school leavers to university, and reimagine higher and further education as a platform for continual through life learning? Do we need new ways of teaching? Do we need new sector specific institutions for the delivery of the specialized and the bespoke? We know institutions such as École 42 in Paris, Flatiron in London, and Pursuit in New York can take people for coding who have no education, but who they can assess for skills and deliver them very quickly in a matter of weeks to a first-class, highly paying job. But is that only in tech? Can we do it in other areas? What other settlements are needed more broadly to pull this off? So these are the issues that we need to discuss, and this is what we're facing. And I'm absolutely thrilled to have a wonderful panel. I'd like to thank all the panelists who've joined us. I'm going to ask them to make a 5-minute or so initial set of remarks, and then we'll turn to questions. And we aim to turn to the audience for questions around 3 o'clock. So the first speaker, because I think the future is determinative, is happily one of the world's leading futurists, Gert Leonhardt, who's joined us and who has been writing and speaking on this issue for many years. So Gert, tell us about the future and tell us how we might adapt to it. Wonderful to have you on with us. Thank you.
Thanks very much. That was a perfect introduction to my topic about the future. I want to start by, obviously technology is impacting our future. Technology is driving our society. Here you have what I call the game changers, right? Big data, cloud computing, Internet of Things, language understanding, 3D printing. There's 10 of them. And basically what's happening now is that in the next 10 years, most of these things that were kind of an idea before, they're becoming real. So I always say that the next 10 years will bring more change than the previous 100 years as far as technology is concerned. And especially now with COVID, all of these things are accelerated, what I call remote everything. Remote learning, remote teaching, remote e-commerce, remote dating, remote concerts and everything. So technology is driving us into this large sort of accelerator. And one of the things that's happening here is that this relationship between humans and machines is changing. Many people feel like they can already talk to machines, like we see in, of course, all the major Hollywood productions or the Nollywood or whatever, Netflixywood, whatever Black Mirror type things, right, where humans and machines are converging. And many other futurists are espousing the idea that we have to become smarter by becoming part machine, you know, what's called the singularity, right? But my view on that is really quite simple, is that as far as machines are concerned, really what we are not looking for, we should not be looking for, is what in Blade Runner 1982, the famous scene was all about when the inventor of the replicant said, really what we're doing here is we're making the robots, the AI, more human than human. You may remember the scene, right? And really, this is not at all what technology is, as, for example, Stuart Russell, the famous AI professor in UC Berkeley, says in his book, this is actually not about more human than human. If we make machines, smart machines, it's about competence, not consciousness. And this is the big difference between humans and machines, right? We are conscious, we're alive, we exist. We're not just data, at least I don't believe we're just data. Right? And this is why I don't fear AI. I think ultimately what we have here is machines with competence, hopefully. As Luciano Faridi says from Oxford Ethics, he puts it even better. Algorithms outperform humans when it's not about understanding emotions, intentions, interpretations, semantics, right? That's what machines should be doing. And I think any initiative that claims to put machines into the human level of consciousness, emotions, intentions is both dangerous and potentially destructive, right? Like, you know, Facebook is such a pretender, you know, that they seem to want to understand more than humans by using algorithms. And that's also, I think, what we have about artificial intelligence. To be true right now, I think it's mostly about IA, intelligent assistance, which is basically smart software. So the hashtag Internet of Things, smart everything, that's basically what we see. And that's basically just smart software. It's not intelligent like a human, but we are going forward in this kind of progress that we see in AI in the next decade or even after that, where it's going to be first becoming more generally intelligent and then potentially super intelligent. Right? And this is a point in time where I think we should make a cut and basically say, okay, this is kind of becoming potentially existential for us. So I think this is the challenge with education and AI. Machines will not be like humans, but if we give it time, they could pretend to be humans, right? So a very important point about what I call the moratorium on AGI, general intelligence, that impacts this discussion. So as far as humans are concerned, this is the most common argument, right? Useless humans, that we become useless when machines become smart. Well, I believe that it is true that anything that can be automated or digitized, like music, records, and so on, yeah, will be. But there's many things you can't automate, even though they are routines, like making a judgment, or driving a car is the best example. Right? We're not useless because a car can drive itself. For the most part, it can actually not drive itself completely, just a little bit. So the reverse of that is also true. Anything that cannot be automated becomes hugely valuable. And this is where education is going. Right? I call this the human-only skills. And they're actually not really skills. They're also like personality traits. You know, they're who we are, not necessarily what we become. They're not necessarily something we can learn at university, but emotions, intuition, creativity, mystery. Right? That is, I think, where we are going. I think this is the ultimate destination of human work. Because computers have a very hard time with all of those things. As I think Moravec once said, whatever is easy for a computer is hard for a human, and vice versa. I think that is really the gist of it. So my proposal is this, really simple, straightforward. Of course, science, technology, engineering, STEM is the key to our future. But let's think about what we as humans can do. I call this HECI as compared to STEM. In my last book, Humanity, Ethics, Creativity, Imagination. And it's no surprise that many graduates of British art schools end up running internet companies in California. Why is that? Because they're good humans, or they are human, right? They have ideas, they invent. Of course, scientists invent as well. The ideal future is the combination of the two. And that is, I think, the challenge for us. It's kind of pictured like this. You have the logic, right, of machines, and then on top of that, you have the unlogic of humans. Because that's really what we're talking about here, right? Humans are not just efficient and not just data. We're actually the opposite, right? We're totally unlike a machine. So this is the recipe for education, in my view. Logic, that's machines. That's what we used to call left brain, right? Sentience, existence. Sapience, wisdom. Right? My recipe for the future of education is awesome humans on top of amazing technology. And I think that is a mission for us also, to redo our curriculums and how to find out, you know, who's best suited for what. It's not everybody is the same, right, as far as education goes. So last picture on this is, you know, when we go back to the 15th century, Leonardo da Vinci, the Vitruvian Man, right? Today's Vitruvian man, Vitruvian woman looks like this, right? We're surrounded by all that tech. And now we have to reposition ourselves and not compete with machines. This is the primary thing. We're not going to compete with machines, especially not in 10 years and 20 years, when machines can have an IQ of 1 billion. I mean, an IQ in terms of logic, right? So that's the key part there. I see a human renaissance coming. A refocus on what makes us human on top of technology that machines can very well do by themselves. And of course, that goes for men and women as well. So that's my 5 minutes of fame or of contribution. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.
Oh, that was fascinating, Gert. Look, quick question. I really like your point about art schools, and I think that art schools were one of the very successful British institutions that didn't wholly exclude working class people. Class is the biggest penalty in Britain, and class determines place, and the place penalty is the greatest source of inequality in our country. And art schools, I think, were very interesting because they let in and they identified working class talent and allowed it to flower, sometimes to global import. But can one imagine a future in which all of these soft skills, design, intuition, can becomes something every individual can excel in, because given the corporate structure of our world, it's likely this will be captured by companies. And you know, the benefit of companies is that they link people of great talent and they outcompete individuals. So one can see that we can have a world in which there's lots of purpose and unalienated labor, like William Morris used to speak about. But how it works and how people make money off it is the same as it is now. So you will just have poor people who might be talented, but nobody's particularly interested in training them. And the economic system as it currently is.
Yeah, well, just a short answer on this. I think the primary thing is that I think every human has those skills of creativity and discovery, imagination, and they're basically, as I think it was Buckminster Fuller, famous futurist, said, that in school they get de-geniused. You know, you take the genius out, right? De-geniusing kind of thing, right? And what we need to do is, you know, bring that genius back. And that's not necessarily only a question of skills or training, it's of self-discovery and that sort of thing. And I think this is really where we're going towards. And to do that, we have to put mechanisms of distribution of income into place, right? So if you want to participate in this, then somebody has to eventually make sure there's room for you. And as many people would agree with, you know, it's quite likely that in 20 years, we're not going to work like we do now. We're not going to work 10 hours. We're going to maybe work an hour for the same money. I mean, it's possible if we make the right decision, right? Especially because of technology. When we're talking about a fundamental change of how we look at work, and, you know, as you said yourself, most research says in 10 years, 50% of all new jobs haven't even been invented yet. So, you know, if you're a taxi driver that loses the job because of an autonomous vehicle, that remains to be seen when that is, right? What will put you in the position to recreate? Well, that is a big question, really, right? But at least we shouldn't create those jobs again. So, as I like to jokingly say sometimes, if you work like a robot will take your job. But a taxi driver doesn't always work like a robot. So it's basically, yeah, it's a complicated question.
Yeah, and wider issues about who owns the innovation. And people have been predicting an artisan future for about 200 years, but it's never happened. More and on. Let's turn to Chris Skidmore, former Minister for University Science, Research and Innovation. That's a lot. And Chris is really one of the brightest minds in the Conservative Party, and he's focused much of his effort and thought to how we might reform and reshape our tertiary education system and how it ought to be versus how it is. So over to you, Chris. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. And I'm not going to be able to compete with Professor Leonard's dynamic and deeply impressive presentation. I must say his talk of algorithms almost got me in a cold sweat, given recent experiences of the government with these. I think it just goes to demonstrate the clash between you know, what you might see as cold scientific behavior versus perceptions of dynamic human behavior, and how we can reconcile the two going forwards. And I think the sort of clashes we've had on algorithms, both in terms of housing and planning for houses and exams, demonstrates this isn't the simple equations that those who work in tech might like us to believe. What I would say when looking at human behavior is that we've had a trend over the past 20 years, which has demonstrated a hunger and a demand across all sections of the population for an increase in their educational standards. And you know, this has been driven by all governments. All credit to the Labour government of 1997 increasing the leaving age, which has gradually ratcheted up ambition and expectation of young people to be able to access post-18 education. But in doing that, we have seen two divides being inadvertently created. Firstly, the so-called haves or have-nots, I think falsely perceived in Tony Blair's ambition to send 50% of young people into higher education, which obviously included technical education at the time, wasn't just simply about degrees, but has been then reinterpreted by the media as being 50% of people to have degrees versus 50% of people not to have degrees. And we have also seen within the overall rising tide of increased participation in education, which obviously we know is an international phenomenon also, and be a huge mistake for the United Kingdom to pull the plug on this while all other countries have continued to push forwards, is there are still chasms of educational underperformance that, while they have improved, nevertheless are completely unacceptable and societally incredibly damaging. So why we see 9% of white working class boys from the Northeast, just 9% of those access higher education. And we've seen elsewhere certain groups in society beginning to sort of turn around their performances, particularly in London across BME groups. But even when they reach university, you're seeing attainment gaps that are stubbornly entrenched. So that a black boy with the same A-level results as a white boy will actually have an 18% difference when it comes to actually their third year in terms of their final degree. So these are institutionalized issues that we do need to deal with in terms of access and participation. But we also need to look again at the issue of qualifications and skills outside of university, so that when we look at, we mentioned Germany, and I'm sure it's not exactly the best comparator country, but this is reflected elsewhere. We have a huge split between the number of individuals who stop at level 3 qualifications versus those who've gone to level 6 qualifications, and very few taking level 4, level 5 qualifications in between, simply because there isn't the choice there to be able to do so. And the government's reforms around further education is intended to be able to look at how we can create new technical qualifications for those who are now going to take T-levels. Once they finish those T-levels, where do they go for the future? And we need to create that route. But what I would say is that in order to allow demand to flourish, we need to look afresh at the existing barriers within the educational qualification system. So firstly, one barrier is obviously there has been a historic underfunding of further education that we need to address. But at the same time, to quote sort of Niemöller, I wouldn't want to look at how we can make the strong weak to make the weak strong. We shouldn't be looking at bringing down the university sector simply to allow the FE sector to step up in its place. And I passionately believe that universities as institutions are already entrenched in local communities in the very same way that we had a red brick university movement in the 19th century. We should be having a red wall university movement in this decade and beyond. From a political perspective, I think there are 1,262 days, not that I'm counting, to the next general election. And when it comes to showing a record of achievement, the government's got to be able to deliver in these red wall seats they've won. Otherwise, they'll lose them. And that's just saying from a party political perspective. But it's why I believe that universities should be part of the answer and the solution, not part of the problem, when delivering higher technical qualifications for the future. And to be able to do that, we need a number of reforms around flexibility. We need to be able to abolish what's called the ELQ rule. So if you already have a qualification at a certain level, we've abolished it for STEM subjects. You can go back and retrain in sciences. But we need to loosen this for all other qualifications so that those who need to retrain can access finance to be able to take alternative qualifications to the future. We need to look again at modular learning and how we can create financing and funding that goes to allow individuals to take modules and then be able to go off to work and then back again, rather than simply the financing being based around an academic year. I know that Toby's going to talk about apprenticeships, but one of the things I saw on campuses time and time again as universities minister was you have the big guns, the Rolls Royces, the Airbuses, companies with more than 250 people being able to afford to allow a degree apprentice to take that 1 day a week off to study. But that route is blocked for SMEs and the bedrock of many sort of regional economies, because they can't simply allow those individuals to have a day off. So we need to look at how we can reform the apprenticeship route for the future if it's going to survive. I mean, post-COVID, where are those apprenticeships coming? But we've got to be able to give companies a break and flexibilities to do that. And I think when we look again at universities, I'm now chair of the advisory board for the UPP Foundation. We've been looking at sort of a civic university network and what we can do to ensure that universities can step up in their responsibilities for disadvantaged communities, for towns. And some of the research we showed that 40% of the local population have never even been near to their university, the university that might actually hold the title of their city in its name. And so how we can ensure that universities take responsibility for wider communitarian efforts in their local regions. And I think that does include educational standards if we're going to bridge the gap between those so-called haves and have-nots. And just to finish, I would like to touch on that changing nature of work, because even if we did establish these qualification reforms that are needed to be able to open up access to level 4 or 5 qualifications, to be able to bridge the gap between FE and HE, which should be a given, but it's not. And sadly, the narratives are still around pitting FE versus HE. What I don't want us to do, as Professor Leonard said, is what we can't do as policymakers is fight the previous decade's battles. So that we've got to be able to look ahead at where the agenda is changing. And I think I'd point to 3 areas where I think we can recognise an agenda changing. So the first is obviously around net zero, which I signed into law when I was interim energy minister. That is, we know we set ourselves on a course now for that adaptation and how we can ingrain skills in that adaptation for the future, looking at sort of new opportunities for work. What I wouldn't want it to happen is for this to be seen as, oh, it's all high value manufacturing jobs. It baking in a further divide between those who don't have the qualifications versus those who can access R&D capital. So proposals like Bio York, for example, in the Yorkshire district, a really good example of where you see further education training being built into that. So you've got manual workers coming on board to be able to deliver the infrastructure requirements for the future. I'd also say that we know that when it comes to changing demographics, the care sector, the NHS sectors, this is always going to be a growth industry. And I think we've got to look again at qualifications, whether it's needed a degree to be a nurse, whether we need to be able to say you must qualify before actually accessing the role and responsibility. I think it'd be much better if we were able to create the step-on, step-off learning environment for these roles, which again do benefit local communities, because then individuals can see themselves, finding a career within the NHS or within the care sector as a result of the qualifications they've been able to achieve in their locality. So I would say those would be my starter for 10. And just to agree finally with Professor Leonard, we've had a focus on the sciences and maths and physics. Our USP as the United Kingdom is understanding the humanities, understanding creative arts, and our ability to be able to think critically. That's one of the drivers why we have international students coming to the United Kingdom in the first place. We close off these subjects, we close off our international student routes, and potentially as a result, we must ensure that when it comes to an uplift in investment in research, we maintain our status within the arts and humanities. It was very heartening to hear from Professor Leonard about HECI, and I'm sure Professor Juliet Black will talk about the British Academy's work they've done on SHAPE here, but we must make sure that remains part of the agenda for the future of skills in this country.
Grace, I fundamentally agree with what you're saying. The sense I get is you're arguing that the HE system, for want of a better expression, needs to be more flexible, more adaptable. Absolutely. What about the idea that universities should somehow not own the FE in their area, so that instead of having 2 institutions kind of trading with one another, which has effectively been the public policy approach to so much with very limited results. It used to be the case that some universities were responsible for FE in their area. Is there a bold approach where we essentially restore that responsibilities for universities, not to level down, but so that they have a stake in the game? Because there's little doubt that FE has failed. There's many good people in FE, but if we want them truly to succeed, don't we need something like that, instead of being awash as in a system that overwhelms them. Anchor them into universities and create genuine pathways whereby the university is also responsible for the FE institution and the pathway between.
Yeah, and I think that if we're looking at enhancing level 4-5 provision in the way that we wish to, so we replace this sort of 50% target with, say, a broader post-18 target. Not that target's the way forward, but just to say that there is an ambition there to increase the number of individuals going beyond that sort of level 3 BTEC, whatever qualification. I mean, we used to have these debates around level 2 and when the leaving age was at 16, but now what we need to recognise is there simply isn't the capital resource in FE to be able to begin to deliver this. So being able to use universities and their experience and their as institutions, I think is absolutely the right way forward to embed this as fast as possible. What I would say is obviously there are great examples and pockets of good experience already beginning to happen. So you've got London's South Bank having worked with Lambeth Council on the College of the Future model in order to totally integrate FE with HE. You've got Edward Peck at Nottingham Trent, who've now set up pseudo campus. Not quite, campus is the wrong model here. What I wouldn't want is universities somehow saying, look, FE sector, we know what we're doing. What I recognise is that, well, what I hope actually is that we could learn from the sort of knowledge exchange frameworks that have been in place for several decades in research, which is to say this isn't about universities opening their doors and giving. It's also about universities learning and respecting and making an effort to understand the individual needs of a community, rather than simply sort of saying, well, here we are and here's what we offer and here's our services. So it's not a one-way system, it's reciprocal. I think that's incredibly important as well. But I would say that for many universities, they're very well placed to be able to offer higher technical qualifications for the future. We've just got to be able to create as a government the financing structures to do that. And one of the easiest ways also is by recognizing that not everyone wants to take a 3-year degree. The 3-year degree, we talked about the death of the 3-year degree for a long time. But what we need to do is say, first year at university should be a level 4 qualification. Second year could be level 5, and recognizing that you could potentially have your cake and eat it by also seeing yourself as having university route, but also bedding in a technical route that you can then go back to finishing at a degree level later on, maybe.
More of this later, and I think now's. Thank you very much, Chris. I think now it's an ideal time to bring in Professor Julia Black, who can speak directly to this and the wider responsibilities of universities. She's currently Strategic Director for Innovation at the London School of Economics, and she's leading on the LSE's 2030 strategy on entrepreneurship, commercialization, and remains a professor in the law department. So Professor Black, your thoughts, please.
Great, thank you. And a fascinating discussion, actually. I quite happily sit and listen to my other panelists for most of the afternoon rather than have to contribute myself. And I agree with very much of what has been said already. And I think it's very striking, the debates around education always revolve around four main questions. What do we want people to know and what skills do we want them to have? Who's going to provide that training and knowledge, and how? Who's going to access that training and knowledge and how? And who's going to pay for it and how? And so we've got the same debates revolving around those poles as we start thinking towards the future. So I just wanted to address each one of those in turn and possibly just pull out some of the policy trilemmas that we have and we've experienced, certainly in the UK, over the last name your period, really. And I think I'll start off with the knowledge and skills, and absolutely going to the point about AI and the skills of the future, and half the jobs that people will have haven't been invented yet, and therefore how do we prepare people for that, and very much thinking about, well, what is it that we are preparing people for? And then in answering that question, we get to a kind of a question about, well, what kind of society and economy do we want? But we never really necessarily put that front and center. That's kind of assumed. And so for, for governments, it's a kind of an economic growth, but they wouldn't necessarily think in that, well, actually, we probably also need people who are going to be able to staff our public services. People who are going to be able to staff our care homes, people who are going to be able to help us contribute to our natural capital, people who are going to help us be able to contribute to other things we want to achieve as a society. So I think, first of all, we never really focus down on properly thinking, well, we should be focusing down properly on thinking, well, actually, what kind of future are we therefore trying to build? And is it always captured in that metric of economic growth satisfactorily? And even if it is, what kind of economy do we think we're going to have? And I think there's often a policy dissonance between the economy that we have and the economy that some politicians or policymakers might want us to have. So we have an economy which is basically a service sector economy, export-led, as you said, in which the creative industries flourish, so one of our core assets, in which we have an incredibly strong value in our cultural historic sector, and in which, however, there seems sometimes often to be a harking back to, well, actually what we need is real jobs for real men. And if we could get back to that heavy manufacturing with real people hammering things away in real ways, then that will be the type of muscular economy we want. We don't want this kind of, creative economy which stands for freelancers, and that's not what we want. And I think we just need to be a little bit more honest sometimes in policy debates about what kind of economy we have and what kind of economy we want to have, and therefore, and linked to that, what wider society we want to have, recognizing that not all this is going to be in our gift. And that changes are coming down the track faster than we want, but we need to be more able, I think, to embrace those and think, well, we're not going to be able to get back to that path, so we have to rethink what that is going to be. And therefore, we have to rethink people's identity and their relationship to their job and what it actually is meaning to them. And it might not be meaning to them higher salary. It might be meaning something different. So that I think we need to actually have much more central to the policy debate. So that's the first point. What kind of knowledge and skills do we want? Are we wanting people to have in our society, and why? And just finally on the skills point, absolutely, I will pick up, thank you very much, Chris, on your cue there, for the types of skills and the types of knowledge. And absolutely, we need the technical knowledge and the knowledge about the natural sciences and the physical sciences that you get from the STEM subjects. But we need to understand about people. And social sciences, humanities and arts, those shape subjects, they are about the study of people and societies over time and space. And if we want to make progress in some of the massive challenges that we have to understand the behaviors and knowledge and cultures of different peoples over time and place. And if we want to understand their interaction with technologies, the natural and the physical world, we have to take those subjects, and we have to take people who have the knowledge and skills in those subjects and get them working with those who have the knowledge and skills of the natural and physical world that they get from studying those STEM subjects. So we need both those knowledge bases, and we need them to be equally strong and equally thriving so that they can work in true collaboration with one another. It's not the role of shape subjects in a way to put lipstick on a pig. It's not the role of shape subjects to take a bad piece of tech and make it socially acceptable somehow. It has to be that co-creation. So we have to have both as being equally strong. So I'll move then down into, and I think one of the things, just finally on that, if you look at employability skills and recognizing the jobs for the future, very interesting piece of Nesta analysis, looking at analysis of 41 million job adverts, identified 66 skills from which the City of London Corporation and others have distilled that down to 16 transversal skills, which will be the future-proofing skills, which are around problem solving, communication, independent working, collaboration, resilience, creativity, etc. And we get those from all of the subjects that we study. So we're looking for a very strong knowledge base and research base across all of those subjects. Now, who provides them? Absolutely agree with everything that Chris Skidmore has been saying in terms of that ladder of qualifications. And we have just gaping holes or chasms. And if you manage to have the economic and social capital to bridge that chasm and get into a university from your A-levels into university, fantastic, really good. But we don't have the supporting structures and the different levels in between. And so we've got that other 50% where we really do have a massive issue that we need to address in terms of who then provides, as it were, those skills and how people access them. And I think what we have, however, here we've had a ricocheting around actually of different policy solutions to this over the last, as I say, maybe a period of time, really, in trying to resolve a policy trilemma, but it's probably a quadrilemma actually. So we've got the goals of different people who are involved in this debate. So first of all, we've got the goals of government. So they want a skilled and internationally competitive workforce to drive economic growth, but not necessarily majoring on the other elements that actually government knows that it needs, but doesn't necessarily major on in these debates when we tend to talk more about private sector workforce, but thinking about our public sector and our third sector, for example. So that's the kind of government role, sort of interests. Employers want people who are work ready, right? So they've got the technical skills, but also some of the transversal skills necessary to contribute to the growth of their particular organization right now, whether that's in the public sector or the private sector or the third sector. And often they're more focused on the transversal skills because they know that they can teach the technical skills, as has already been alluded to. What about individuals? Well, actually, what do they want in this? That's a really, so some want knowledge and skills to enable them to follow careers and futures which are meaningful for them. That might mean getting a high salary. It might mean caring for somebody. It might mean being part of the creative sector. Money isn't the driver for everybody. And if you've got a bunch of people who are academics and working in the private and working in the public sector, you've already identified that because they know they could have earned more money elsewhere and make conscious choices not to do that. So, we've also got individuals who might want knowledge for knowledge's sake, for that intrinsic value of knowing something, of understanding something. And yes, they may want to turn that into an instrumental thing in their career and follow a vocational track right from very early age, but they might not. And then also the other thing that gets missed in this debate is, well, what about the providers themselves? What about the educational institutions themselves? Actually, what is their own mission? And what is the mission of people who are in those universities or in those further education providers? And it might be that their mission is to train others. It might be that actually, for a large part, if you're talking about the research intensive sector of universities, actually it is the pursuit of knowledge for knowledge's sake, or because it can then go on and transform and have that policy impact. But those providers and actually what their role is and their agency in this is often, again, slightly silenced. They're not silent, but they're silenced because it's actually, well, this is what we want them to do. We need them to take over FE colleges, or we need them to do this, or we need them to do that. But actually getting that voice back in, some could say it might already be there, but just to think about, well, okay, well, how then, we've got these different goals, how are we actually going to resolve this? And moreover, do we want to define this at the national level? And we already haven't, because it's already devolved. So we must make sure this is not an England-only conversation, but evolution is devolved across 4 nations. Do we want these defined at the national level? Do we want this defined across conversations across local community groups? The College for the Future report, for example, came out last week, says it should be done at that local, more regional level, or do we want it done at the individual level through the market mechanism of an individual who goes out and shops, as it were, for their degree or for their qualification? And we haven't really actually resolved that. And we haven't resolved actually whether we have further education providers or university providers are utilities, are they private actors in a marketplace? Are we aiming for collaboration here? Are we aiming for competition? Are we aiming at a national basis, or actually we looking at contribution to global society and universities as an export business? So I think there's a number of things that we need to resolve, or just have really fundamental, more frank conversations about before we can start to take some of these debates on.
I think that was wonderful, Julia, if I may say so. What particularly struck me is your remark about what's education for from the perspective of individuals. And, there's been quite a lot of anthropological, sociological work on status. And we're clearly status-governed creatures. And one of the things about globalization is it's created a monopoly of status. So there's only very limited ways people can feel good about themselves. Whereas the advantage of a more localized world is there's lots of ways that people could, or were used to be able to feel good about themselves. And our education system can't really answer that. It can't really distribute worth to occupations that the wider culture doesn't give value to. That's quite a big discrepancy. And I was a university academic for oh gosh, probably 20 years. And what's interesting is in any assessment of class, university academics were right at the top, even though they weren't paid particularly well, as your point. So there's different ways to do it. But if we're really interested in tackling inequality, we've got to tackle the penalty of work with no status, which is what David Goodhart has written about, hand and heart in his latest book. And if we don't do that, most of the populism that has beset the Western world has come from people who are denied status and the consequences of that. So the really interesting issue, and this goes to Gert's point earlier, is how can we give status to people? And can universities that have this very important function, can they remold themselves such that merely by entering it and accruing whatever these skills do, you can in some sense accord status to people? I'd just like your thoughts on that, if I may.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thought. I mean, I think you're right, and linked to that, I suppose, in a way, is a university degree is a credence good in economics terms. You don't, you have to have faith in it. You can't experience it. It's too late to take it back, etc. But it's also positional good. Yeah. And so it was absolutely no surprise, in a way, that that fee levels float up. Not necessarily, not least actually, because that can reflect the cost of provision. But in this, to sort of quote the Stella Artois sort of slogan, it's reassuringly expensive. And so I suppose what one's asking there is, well, what we need to do there is, and it goes back to the status of taking a technical qualification, and it goes back to the post-92s and making those universities. Why would that need to be done? Actually, not necessarily for any good reason, other than partly a status, if it was lower status. So I think that is a very difficult thing to change. You're not going to change that overnight, because it's about a policy narrative. It's about a wider cultural narrative. That this is it is a fantastic thing, to have an education at all and secondly, that actually to have an education that enables you to go on and fulfill what it is you want to be in the way you want to be it, and contribute to society in that way. And so we have to now, whether in a way getting there for universities, as it were, to partner with FE or to engage in these different provisions is partly to get them to lend their status, as it were, and give them a kind of a hallmark around that, then I think that's certainly worth exploring. I think from the perspective of somebody who's inside a university, however, it does feel slightly odd to be told that universities have status where we just seem to be completely trashed the entire time in the media, and all our credibility has been taken away, and sort of silence in different political debates. But I absolutely do take your point there. But I think therefore, that's why I'd go back to the kind of, well, what kind of economy do we want? So what's a proper job? And actually, yeah, you can have a proper job in the creative industry. You can have a proper job as a professionally technical technician. So I think you're absolutely with you, but there's a wider narrative change.
I just want to turn to Toby, who fantastically, it's very kind of him, is the Minister for Lifelong Learning, that I think is the most important thing. But I just remember for years in public policy, we've heard education's the answer. And it just isn't in its current form to inequality. Yeah. And that's the point. And unless we reform our institutions in a radical way, pumping money into education but leaving the system unchanged will only widen the inequalities that already exist. I leave that there as a point of, not as an assertion, as a point to discuss. And I turn to Toby. Toby, thank you so much for joining us. You were invited back onto the front bench by Keir Starmer, and I think you have one of the most crucial roles, particularly in opposition on this most vital of questions. And that is you are the Minister for Apprenticeships, but also lifelong learning. And I'd love to, what we desperately need, I think, is a visionary political approach on exactly this issue. Don't worry, I'm not asking you to give one now, but it's wonderful to have you with us. So over to you, Toby.
Well, thanks so much, Philip, and thanks to Respublica for the invitation. It's always particularly nice to get that coveted fifth speaker slot that we all crave, and when you have that, you're always somewhat apprehensive that the enthusiasm of the audience may be somewhat waning, particularly when you're coming on half an hour after expected, which is again entirely commonplace and what you would normally have. But the great advantage of being the fifth speaker is that you get an opportunity to think about the contributions that already been made, and I think there's been some really interesting ones. And a great deal that I think fits in with our thinking. You're right to say that obviously we're not at this early stage in the Parliament coming out with entirely sort of finalised viewpoints on this, but our thinking is developing, partly along the lines of the Lifelong Learning Commission that the previous Labour Shadow Skills Minister, Gordon Marsden, was at the forefront of. And I think in terms of the contribution that you made, Philip, you're absolutely right that there is an immediate priority about avoiding mass unemployment, avoiding a wasted generation, supporting people who are looking to enter the world of work now. And there is also a much longer term sense in which the issues that are facing us now were challenges long before coronavirus. And I think that we have a critique of government's approach at the moment in terms of its lack of urgency and scale that I think would be probably widely viewed. But we're also encouraged that there is at least more discussion about further education and skills. Now, what I would take issue with was your description of further education as having failed. I think it's simplistic to say that further education has failed. I think that what we in government or what the political class has maybe done over at least the last 10 years and possibly longer than that, it is poorly defined what we think further education is for, and also it's been very much a changing picture. So in a context of a 30% reduction in funding for further education, 50% reduction in the amount spent on adult education and lifelong learning, to dismiss FE as having failed and suggest therefore that HE should take over is something I will be hostile to. I do think that, however, there is much more potential within further education than we're currently achieving. And I think you were right to say, and that Gavin Williamson is also guilty of being simplistic, to say that what we need is purely to look towards Germany, and whilst they have an excellent skills regime, I think Professor Black is absolutely right that skills regime needs to be seen in the context of the economy that you have, and needs to be, a skills policy is only as good as the industrial strategy that goes with it. And I think that the approach that we'll be taking in the Labour Party will be very much about a holistic approach that recognises skills within a devolution agenda, within the industrial strategy arena, based around the kind of economy we currently have, as well as the one that we might wish to transition more towards. And I think that Gerd's challenge to us about the change that we're going to experience in the next 10 years being greater than that we've experienced in the previous 100 years. And I think you could arguably say the same about the last 10 years. And so, in an era of change, skill and education is going to be all the more important. And I think that you're right to say that we need to place our skills policy in the context of the kind of economy that we currently have, and as well as the one that we might want to have. In terms of, Chris was right to say that I would have a real focus on apprenticeships. I think they're absolutely rightly seen as the gold standard of vocational and technical education. I think there's much more to skills policy than apprenticeships, but it's a pretty good place to start. And I think that even before COVID, we had a worrying reduction in the number of level 2 and 3 apprenticeships, particularly for 16 to 19-year-olds. I think Chris was absolutely right to say that a more modular approach is going to be incredibly important going forward, and that whatever institutions provide that skills training or skills education needs to fit in with the ability of people to do it on a week by week rather than a 3-year commitment sort of basis. And I think the suggestion that Chris makes about level 4 in the first year of a university degree and so on is a very sensible one. And I think he's also right to focus upon the role that major employers, major manufacturing employers play. He mentioned Rolls-Royce, I think Airbus, because my sense is that far too much of the apprenticeships policy, particularly the last 5 years, has been focused on what works in those kind of institutions, and far too little has been focused on smaller employers and their ability to access skills. And if you're going to have a skills strategy that's genuinely focused on red wall constituencies and levelling up, then you need to recognise that in many of those areas, like my own constituency, Chesterfield, the number of major employers is very, very few. And you will only have a strong skills approach if you have one that enables small businesses to engage with it. So I'm going to, I very much enjoyed the report that you produced. I'm very interested in the specific idea around sector-specific institutions in specialised areas. I think that there's a lot more that we can learn from some of the institutions that you referred to internationally. And I think that whilst any sort of one-size-fits-all silver bullet should be avoided, this is a complicated area that needs a complicated response or a nuanced response. I think there is a great deal in that, and I think there were other things. I was very interested in your suggestion around where funding might come from. I would be pretty cautious about suggesting that to the Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, because I know how many different demands there are on additional taxes likely to be coming in front of her in the next few months. But I think there does need to be, alongside a recognition that the ability to be able to afford it is one of the major barriers that prevents people developing their careers, there does need to be a serious recognition of the funding challenges that face our skills approach. So I'll leave it there. There's much more that we can maybe pick up in questions, but thanks very much for the invitation and for the thought-provoking report.
Thank you very much, Toby. A couple of remarks. I have many flaws, as anyone who knows me can attest. And one of those is that I do think that we need to be brave about institutions. And when our institutions aren't delivering, it's not meant to impugn anyone who works in them. It's to say that something's wrong in our institutional mix. And I'm enough of a revolutionary and enough of a conservative to say that the most radical thing is setting up new institutions. And that's what the Labour Party did in 1945. And I actually think our institutional mix at this juncture is not going to work to deliver the skill set in the UK. That's genuinely what I think. And so I think we need a merger and a reform of the institutions, but I'll leave that there as to something for discussion. I greatly welcome your reaction to my colleague Mark Moran, who wrote Skills for Jobs That Don't Exist Yet. And I'd also like to thank Jules Green and his family who helped fund that and make that possible. Mike, could you post that report on the Q&A so everybody can read it? Now, one of the things Mark and I discussed is the funding issue. Now, what we propose in our report is that we take skills funding a bit like national insurance funding, and everybody pays in. the individual, the employer, and the government. And we have, and you know, and I know it was broken before, but I still think it's a good idea, some form of individual learning account. This isn't entirely new. In Italy, they have a form of national insurance that all workers pay into that skills you up for retraining. I also remember back in the day, I proposed to Number 10's policy unit when Cameron was in power, a version whereby we broke up the 3-year degree system, whereby we should award a BA degree for the first 2 years of your education and let you take your 3rd year or your honours degree at any time later when you're in a profession. And that can be co-funded with your employer. And that pays for itself because the loan element and the cost element is dramatically reduced. And that, I thought, and I still think, is a way to jumpstart everybody to a master's level, because then you would have essentially employer funding and your 3rd year funding, and you could broaden that final year into a master's level qualification in the field you're in. So there's 2 ideas from Res Publica, Mark Moran's idea, which I also put support of individual learning accounts, and my own about how we might break up the degree. What I'd like to do now is turn to the questions. So to the attendees, could you please post your questions? I'll flag if we're going to use them so you can prepare. But first of all, we got a question from Jules Green. Jules, are you online? Mike, can you post him online?
Jules, I think you're muted.
Sorry, this always happens. Yeah, when I ask you to come on, you need to unmute yourself.
Right, hi.
Hi, Jules, great to see you.
My computer just had a lock, you know, the typical.
Oh, well, just go ahead and ask the question. We can see your name, don't worry.
Oh, sorry, I can, that's it. Okay.
There you go, Jules.
Right.
Ask your question.
Firstly, Philip and the panel, thank you very much for putting together such a great event. You know, I just want to say how delighted I was with the nature and the quality of the debate. And I think the positioning was spot on. My principal interest, and the one thing I really, you know, think I want to get across, is based on an idea. And, you know, basically the idea is obviously the most important thing we've got as a human being. It is that education is the most critical foundation stone for the development of individuals and for society. And I really think that this needs a lot more attention. We've got a lot of problems, but critically, what is the most important foundation stone in a person or society? I put it there. And obviously, in today's circumstances with the COVID pandemic, perhaps the lasting impact will be that it has exposed inequality in society, the inequalities that exist in society in many ways. And in particular, it's also exposed the importance of education. It has also accelerated the change towards the 4th industrial revolution that Gerd was talking about. I should disclose that I am an LSE alumni, Julia, and I've been a philanthropist for the LSE over the last 10 years. And this is basically due to a belief that education is the most leveraged way to affect a positive outcome in society. Last week, I took part in an event chaired by Baroness Shafiq, the director of LSE, on social mobility and student support at LSE. And, you know, it was pretty interesting because it came together when you linked it all together and brought across exactly what we're talking about in this debate today. it highlighted three key messages for me. The first thing is both my parents went to LSE and they came from fairly disadvantaged backgrounds, and they went up to LSE in the 50s. And my mother was listening to that event with Manoush, and she said, Julian, you know, that nothing has changed since I went up to LSE on social mobility. And I think that's a really striking point to understand, that the issues highlighted by Dr. Abigail McKnight and Professor Dilly Fung are the same as they were 60 to 70 years ago. That's pretty interesting, because it really demonstrates that, you know, we've got a big job on our hands, and an interesting job to change the system. The second key message that came out of this was that the system is failing. And we had some pretty hard-nosed LSE alumni on that event. And basically, people that go to LSE just are very direct and do not pull their punches, and they really get stuck in. And I'm always a bit surprised, because I'm never confident enough to do that, but I try to be. And it was the first thing was that, you know, Abigail McKnight said, you know, that 55% of student loans won't be paid back, and you know, over their careers up to the age of you know, 50. And this in itself is a complete illustration, as good as you could have, at how poor our system is. That if the investment that goes in now cannot be paid back, it's a waste of time. And if 55% of the individuals that go into our system are failing to pay back, you've got to say that's really serious. The second thing I think, and this is more my thought, is that currently, you know, if you don't get a 2-1, you know, you just literally, the computer says no. In this day and age, when everything is applied for online, and is, I mean, my son, fortunately, got a good degree, but it took him 6 months to get an interview. He was best in class at Bristol, you know, literally the best in class, and with a first class degree in psychology. And then suddenly he got 3 interviews in the same week, which is kind of ironic. But it is very tricky to get through the current employment, you know, getting a first job. And if you don't get a 2-1, you're on the scrap heap right at the beginning of your career, and it's terribly demoralizing. And that's
can I take those 2 questions? Because I'm just conscious we've got others. And tell me if this is right. So we have a social mobility question, which I think is absolutely crucial. And I would sort of want to pose this to the panel again, you know, and I'm not sure that we've cracked it. How do we make genuinely these things enhancing to the general population? Are we going to reform at scale, or are we just going to argue for more funding into the existing pot? And then I think the second part that Jules is talking about really is, and it's the same thing Toby was talking about, how do we save the current generation? We know from all the evidence in labour market economics that the longer you're out of the job, the harder it is for you to get back. And the evidence from the last big UK recession is some people never get back. So they're the 2 questions. You have.
Phil, I just want to add one more point, which is, you know, it's the point that Julia Black made, which is that there's 50% of people that don't go to university, right, and don't get a degree, and they're automatically, you know, treated in a different way, which is appalling. So we need basically a value system to be completely reorientated to value the things that people have been talking about in this talk, which is why I said it was a spot-on talk, that we really need to value other people, people that don't, it's not necessarily a salary contest. That's it.
And I think, thanks, Jules. I think that's a lovely remark. And Julia, I think you spoke extremely well to this about universities confer status. That's very powerful in this, very powerful. Can they confer genuine status in more different ways? I'll come back to you shortly. What I'm going to do is I want to collect 3 more questions and then go to the panel, and you can choose which question you would like to ask. I've just found in the past this is the best way. So Mike, can we have the first question from the attendees, please?
Andrew has dropped off, so I'm going to go to Lola.
Yeah, okay, go ahead. Lola, you there?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, can't see you. Mike, can you put her on?
The video is on.
I think I have my video. First, thank you so much. I thought the entire conference was extremely insightful. And my question is about, and you touched at some moment about the idea that some ideas grant you social value, and there is a form of being inside a university that is definitely about social signaling. Building on this specifically, I have found in my numerous years in universities and here in Oxford that there is a growing set of ideas or theories in general revolving around gender and race in particular, but not only, that grants people a lot of value and power, although in many ways the scientificity of those theories has been disproved or at least discussed. And those things being growing in universities are pushing away a lot of people who don't agree with those set of ideas or even struggle against it. And in the kind of the other side of the coin is that it is also targeting a lot of people in society, including the poorest. And we've been talking a lot about lower classes in society. And so my question is, do you see that indeed as a threat? And if so, what would be the ways to, well, handle this problem? For example, the state is still funding or giving funds for that. Shouldn't we see a form of defunding, or at least a form to regulate by the way of the money, basically? Hope that was clear.
I think that's another crucial point, that there's an appearance, not necessarily the reality, that universities are now being taken over by very extreme dialogues, what you call the woke, that in a sense are all class-based dialogues that penalize class entry, because people think, oh, those values that are dominant at the university aren't my values. So they become another soft barrier to working class or other forms of participation. So we don't have values diversity increasingly in universities. So that's a very interesting issue. Let's go to Helen Clements, please. Mike.
Hi, sorry, I can't seem to get rid of my picture on there. I can't work that out. So there you go. There's some training opportunity for me straight off. It's very interesting debate. And I perhaps take a slightly different viewpoint, and in fact I sort of agree a lot with Julia that we put a lot of, and this might not be exactly how you phrased it, Julia, but I think we put a lot on people feeling that if they're not academic they're not worthy, and that goes back to the social value of what is important to an individual. And I think we do that from day one when they enter school, and it really concerns me that we knock young people's confidence that if they don't achieve the academic ability, then they're not worthy. And therefore, really, we're not being an inclusive education system, because if you're not academic, you're put into the scrap heap, and you don't then even feel worthy of going for what I would class as entry-level roles in any sector, irrelevant of pay, to work your way up. So we have this real conversation about aspirational careers. Why isn't any job aspirational anymore? When I left school, getting a job was the aspiration, and then where you went from that job and worked your way up the ladder was what was important. It was quite interesting. I think, was it Jules, you saying about your son couldn't get a job for X amount of time, and actually I don't know that it had anything to do with the 2-1. It might have been, what was his work experience? What did he have on his CV that brought to attention to those employers? And I'm not saying he didn't, because I've not seen his CV, but I am somebody that gets involved with recruitment and helping young people get their CVs in a best place. And sometimes it's about, what they can demonstrate they've got on soft skills, not what they've got in academia. We need the academia for them to be able to do those degree level apprenticeships. That's not what we as an employer are requesting. It's what academia is saying they need to have to continue their learning, and that limits who we can take on.
Okay, thanks, Helen. Again, another recognition of the importance of status, and we shouldn't forget that the penalty, it's a game where it's creating winners and losers, and there must be ways we can mitigate that loss, because the loss can be quite crippling. Thank you. We have another question from Jonathan Woodhead. Jonathan, are you with us?
Hi, Philip. Yep, I think.
Lovely.
Can you hear me?
You,
yep, great. Hi, I'm on the screen, I think, as well now. Hi, thanks. I just think it's just a collection of thoughts. I'm sort of calling in, if you like, from a Birkbeck perspective. And for those of you who don't know, Birkbeck is a college of the University of London, but it specialises in part-time and evening teaching of degree standard and above. And it's been essentially doing the same thing for about 200 years for educating working Londoners and people that basically have got a day job or other commitments, and they come to us in the evening and do whatever they want to do, whether that's vocational or perhaps more more humanities based or practical based, that kind of thing. I mean, I think, because I've been involved in these debates sort of professionally for quite a few years, and I worry that we're in danger of reinventing the wheel again with some of this stuff, but with also to no success. I mean, I remember probably nearly 20 years ago now, Margaret Hodge launched the foundation degree, which was a sort of 2-year sub-degree qualification, which seems to have kind of evaporated in many areas. I mean, the numbers of students that want to take them at Birkbeck has fallen off a cliff. Prior to that, we've had HNDs and HNCs, which were largely offered in FE, but also HE were offering them as well. I mean, that qualification has been around for the best part of 60 years. And that the numbers of students wanting to do that has dropped off. So, there have been structures out there for people wanting to do a 2-year qualification in HE or FE and then progress, but that isn't what people want to do anymore. It may be in future. I'm not saying the past is necessarily always a good judge, but we have to look at where we have been previously. But curiously, it does work well in other countries. I mean, California, for example, have associate degrees, which are essentially 2-year degrees, and then you can step off after the 2 years and then continue a further 2 years, because of course degrees are 4 years in the US and not 3, to continue onwards if you wish. So there are different models out there. I mean, I was very pleased, Philip, to hear your support about the lifelong learning accounts. I mean, of course, that's in the government's Auger review. Well, it wasn't the government's review, but the independent review. But obviously government need to respond, but the Auger panel, if you like, obviously again, that's actually quite an old idea as well, going back to individual learning accounts in the late 90s, early 2000s, which didn't work for various reasons. But again, I think it's worth having another go at that. Singapore have skills credits, which are largely the same idea, and obviously they're able to put a little bit more money into it than perhaps we might be able to here, but again, the principle's the same. Austria do something similar. So there are lots of really good international examples, and Alison Wolf obviously is a real expert on this sort of stuff if you haven't spoken to her about it already. But I think we're on the cusp of something different because of Brexit and because of COVID-19. I think the appetite is there for something different, but at the same time, I'm hugely conscious in the policy debate that we have been here before and some of the things just haven't worked. So I think the real answer is to change the incentives to institutions. If you want people to do more step in, step off qualifications, you've got to change the funding formula to encourage universities to do it, because otherwise stick with the tried and tested formula, which you've all talked about, of 18-year-olds doing 3 or 4-year degrees, moving away from home in the main, which is fine, but we've all established that isn't what the country necessarily needs. So I think that's really the starting point, is change the funding formula, and then incentives will follow. I could also talk about part-time study and ELQ, but I won't. But I think you get the message.
Yeah, no, Jonathan, fantastic question. Thank you. And I think that the point is, in the UK, as long as we keep giving value to this 18-year-old model, it will outcompete every other model, right? That's why I think that incremental change will not deliver at this juncture. But look, let me go back through our marvelous panelists, and I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank you all once again, and take them in the order, reverse order that they spoke. You can't answer all of the questions, but do try and choose one, or if you'd like, if you feel that you would like to speak at a deeper level, and that also answers, and that's also fine as well. So let me turn to Toby. First of all, I'd like to give you first response, if I may, Toby.
That's great, Philip. Yeah, thank you very much. In terms of Jules' question, which I think touched then upon what other people were saying, which was about inequality and educational inequality, about the extent that non-academic qualifications and non-academic education is seen as being of less value, and I think that it is an area that's incredibly important. And you were asking, Philip, about whether it was institutional change that was needed or simply budget. I mean, I have to say that I don't think that budget is by any means the whole of the answer here, but it is certainly a part of it. You can't have the level of cuts that we've had to the skills budget and expect that it isn't going to impact on the ability of those institutions to be creative and to deliver more. So I think what we need going forward, by all means, to look at institutions. I'm not hostile to that, but I'm just conscious that any institutional change takes years, costs more, takes longer than you expect to get bedded in. And given the sort of scale of change and the immediacy of the challenge that faces us, and the sort of likelihood that we're going to be in a period where government's looking at how can they spend less rather than how can they spend more, the major priority is achieving more with what we've got than necessarily institutional change. I appreciate that that's something that appeals to you. I think that the question of place is incredibly important in this. This government now appears to be much less enthusiastic about the devolution agenda than its predecessor a couple of years or so ago was, and I think there is a role for local sort of collaboration between education providers and employers and the labour market to try and have a more strategic approach to what is needed both locally and nationally, and try and then ensure the institutions are better placed to respond to that. So I'll leave it there, and conscious of the time and the need for other speakers to come in. But thanks again for the invitation to come on, and to the other panellists who I think have been really thought-provoking.
Thank you so much, Toby, and we're very grateful to you. Professor Julia Black.
Thank you, and thank you very much for all of the questions as well, and Jules for your comments too and thoughts. To be honest, each one of these questions and each one of these thoughts could be a panel event in its own right, to be frank. So I think I'm going to zone in, I think, on the need for much more flexibility within the system than we have at the moment. At the moment, we have little pots of money which are attached to different schemes. So we've got an apprentices fund for an apprenticeship scheme. We've got loans, but for certain qualifications and not for others, and not to go backwards, but only in certain subjects, etc. As has been kind of described. And I think in terms of the funding system, I think we have to recognise that we want that agility and people to be really engaging in lifelong learning. And I speak as somebody who's, within my own family, I've got the, 70-year-old relative doing their first degree, and a 55-year-old, another one doing a foundation degree, and somebody who never went to university winning Queen's Enterprises rewards, and I'm an academic. So across this piece, we have to really take this lifelong learning very seriously, and therefore provide the funding and the agility that is going to match with that. But in that funding, and this goes to the point of, well, who pays, and how do we? I think we need to recognise within that education is a public and a private benefit. So that yes, there is a a return to the individual, and they should be paying for some of it, but there was a return to the taxpayer, as it were, and to the public and to government. And so a contribution from there, but also, and I think, Res Publica, I think it's a really interesting idea that you pick up there in relation to the employer contribution, but also making that much more flexible in a way, and learning the lessons of the different policy ideas we've had in the past around this. So really, in other words, taking agility seriously. And then finally, my final point, just to the question of, you're not worthy if you're an academic, and how students should all of this start. Actually, we're talking about, the further end, as it were, of the educational system. All the evidence goes that actually, in terms of you want return on your investment in your educational system, where do you put it? You put it in early years. So actually, if we really want to engage in structural and generational change, we need to go back to Sure Start, and we need to go back to the 2 to 3 year olds, and we need to rethink the whole thing from that very first base. But that's another session for another time.
That's I always like contributions that could open up another whole debate. Thank you so much, Julia. Chris.
I'd say, we've talked about this sort of tripartite sort of indenture of rights and responsibilities, financial responsibilities in particular, between the student, the government, and the university. And I think that's a model worth, continuing to explore. The first questioner mentioned the issue of what's now called the disaggregated RAB charge, or the now over 50% of student debt finance that won't be repaid over the tenure that is given before the debt is wiped off. And I think this is clearly going to be a narrative that's not going away. We've just seen Joe Biden today stating that student debt cancellation does figure in his plan, and whether that's actually the right thing to do or not in terms of looking after those disadvantages, I'm not sure. But what I would say from a government perspective is that now we have the debt on the ONS books in a way that it wasn't 2 years ago. It makes sense to seriously consider how you can convert loans into grants, because obviously that money is being written off anyway, without obviously then the interest on top. So whether you can, and this goes to the role of government as an active agent here, I think there's an open debate to be had whether government actually has the ability to pick winners when it comes to course qualifications that will deliver on the economy of the future. I'm sort of skeptical, but I can see a route by which government may wish to then look at sort of grant formation around certain subjects to be able to fill skills gaps, and that may be a route forward. We've already seen this when it comes to NHS provision and nursing. Obviously, we had the nursing bursary cancelled because one of the issues, and I've spoken about nursing, I could see one of the questioners written up saying, well, why should nurses, medicine becoming more technocratic, therefore we need sort of more nursing degrees. But a lot of people were doing nursing degrees, bagging the degree with the bursary and going off and doing something entirely different. So you've got to be careful here about the incentive mechanism. And I would like to posit that I think the student financing will definitely need to be reformed in the next 30 years, otherwise it's going to fall off a cliff. The actual student loans company won't be able to cope with the level of debt, and it certainly it's unsustainable for the future. But let's try and turn that potential crisis into an opportunity for targeting where maybe student debt cancellation could take place in order to create more effective levers for the future. And I would just like to say that when it comes to Jonathan's Woodhead's point around foundation degrees and the demand, clearly there is a demand and a growing demographic of 18-year-olds now who are going to come in and fill university places. So even if you try to hive away certain university places into the FE sector or even into higher technical education delivered by universities, you're still going to have more students than before, simply because of that rising demographic from the 2008 birth cohorts. But nevertheless, COVID has demonstrated that we have the ability, if we wish in the higher education sector, to act rapidly. There's always another excuse, another charter, another way of kicking the can down the road previously. But when things need to happen, the sector will respond rapidly. And it's how can we convert that energy and that potential for innovation in a crisis into how can we innovate in times of normality in peacetime. And so looking again at the qualification system, the first question I mentioned about 2 1s and there's 2 2s, and it's absolutely right. You have a driver then to ensure that you get a large number of students getting 2 1s first, so-called grade inflation. Now, there are reasons for why that takes place, but between institutions, it's quite unfair why some institutions have more 2 1s and firsts than others. And I think we need to be looking at benchmarking to be able to deliver better transparency into institution around exactly what a degree's value is, and it's awarded so that it can retain its currency for the future. But nevertheless, institutions like universities have the ability, if they wish, to reform, and let's get on and try to use COVID as a catalyst for doing so in very much in the same way, Philip, you mentioned about a post-1945 scenario. It can be done if you want it to be done.
Thank you very much, Chris. And Gert, I'm sorry to say this, but it's back to the future with you.
Well, great. It's been a great conversation. Thanks very much for all the input. It was quite stimulating here. So I want to put my futurist hat back on and say that basically I understand the arguments and the conversation about what is happening now. I am a little bit worried about the idea of saying that we're looking at education, training, and so on with a rear view or a sort of frontal view from the windshield, right? But really what we should do is we should come back from the future, because we're talking about the future is going to be here much quicker than we've ever thought. Right? Like I said, 10 years. Right? When we look 10 years in the future, maybe we're trying to fix something that we will never need again. This is something we have to think about. In a world where we are shifting from stuff to ideas, that's what we're producing ideas now, essentially, right? Ideas, services, IP, thinking, humanity, whatever. We're in a world where we're going to go from the idea of work and job to, let's say, occupation of a sort, right? Where this whole idea of status is going to be a lot more flexible and agile, and also, as was rightly said, put into me as a child. So we're looking at this at what we have today and improving it for the future. But what we should be doing is saying, okay, what is 10 years from now? What is the situation, and what do we need to be ready for the future 10 years from now, which is going to be radically different, exponentially different, intelligent machines, quantum computing, AI, virtual reality, globalization, global government possibly, right? I mean, we're talking about, and that is the world that we need to think about when we think about education. So I would suggest a dual-fold approach. We do the best we can to fix what we have now. And then we think about, what does a reboot look like? And I totally agree. This has to be a wider view. It may not be in the system that we have today, right? I think William Gibson, the science fiction author, once said, the future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed. And if we can get more distribution, yeah, if we can get more distribution, that will be a good one.
Final question. What bit of the world, what bit of our current world has the most future now? What is the most telling bit of our world that tells us the future now?
I think we all have little bits of pieces in terms of education and training. I think Finland is pretty far along on that end. Here in Switzerland, we have an interesting system on this. The UK is very specific because of the creative arts and the art school and that whole section of the world of ideas, right? I think was Winston Churchill once said, the company of the future is the company of ideas, or something of that sort, right? And I think that's the way moving too. And we can see that happening all in different pockets. And I think if we can bring that together, we can create something really powerful.
Okay. Can I just once more genuinely thank all the panelists? It's been an honor and a pleasure to listen to you all. I think we've had a really broad, innovative, exciting discussion. I'd refer you once again to my colleague Mark Moran's report, which Mike has posted on skills for jobs that don't exist yet. And I'd like to thank Jules for supporting that. We would like to do more work in this area. So if you're online and want to work with us, get in touch. I certainly think this is, for any society that wants to tackle inequality, this is one of the key sites of intervention. On that note, I wish you all well, stay safe, have a lovely rest of the week, and may your lockdown go well. All the best to you. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank you.